Hello, and welcome to the third of our series of webinars on our new book, System1 Unlocking Profitable Growth. This webinar, we will be looking at advertising, particularly emotional advertising, and how to use it to build profitable growth for your brand and your business. I'm Tom Ewing, and with me is System1's Chief Innovation Officer, Orlando Wood.
Hello, everyone.
And we will be taking you through, as stated, the System1 book, which is coming out in print in a few short weeks in June. And we've been serializing it on our website in 5 chapters. There's already been webinars on decision-making and innovation. In decision-making, we talked about how the fast and frugal, intuitive, emotional System1 is the key driver of human decision-making. It's that's how we make all our most important, well, all our decisions, important and unimportant. And in innovation, we talked about how this affects new products, talking especially about fluency and how you need that acceptability and that reassuring familiarity. And now we're moving on to advertising. We're talking about the role of the emotions, and then in future webinars we'll be looking at brand building and shopper marketing. So advertising, but before we get started actually, there's a couple of things I'd like to ask you. Firstly, if you have any questions at any point over the course of this webinar, please do feel free to ask them in the webinar, the question panel on your GoToWebinar interface, and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. And the other thing I'd like to ask is for you to call an advert to mind, a memorable advert. Just the first one that comes to mind, and then hold it in your mind while we talk about advertising. Orlando, do you have a memorable advert?
I do have a memorable advert. A memorable advert, it's for toilet tissue brand Le Trèfle, and it ran in France, and it's one I think I'd like to show you now, because we're going to talk just a little bit about it. So here we go.
Emma. 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 Emma.
That's a great ad. So what's it doing? How's it using emotion, Orlando?
Well, it's engaging, it's funny, it's it's an emotional ad, and an emotional ad for a product in a category that might typically be thought of as a low interest category. I mean, I think it goes to show that there isn't such a thing as low interest categories, only low interest brands and low interest marketing. It's a fantastic example of emotional advertising. But it's not just a good example of an emotional ad. It's an ad that delivered in commercial terms as well. So it's hugely successful. It led to a run on the product, and once back in stock, the sales in France more than doubled for this brand, and it also achieved huge numbers of views, 25 million views on the internet, and which enabled it to broaden its geographic footprint, so gaining distribution in 6 new markets. So just a nice example of a memorable ad that comes quickly to mind, for me at least, that's engaging and also hugely successful when it comes to the commercial side of things.
And I would imagine that for most people, actually, most of you, or almost all of you, the memorable ad that you came to would also have been a very emotional one, something that made you feel something. The more you feel, the more you buy, is our watchword in advertising. But what's the science behind that, Orlando? Why is emotion so important?
Well, emotion's important because when we feel something, or an emotional impression is made on us by something, it tends to be something that is remembered, and it helps us in the future to make decisions quickly and easily through System 1. So it's a way of emotion simplifies and guides decision making. Perhaps if I just read out a couple of paragraphs from the book on this, which refer to a neuroscientist and psychologist called Antonio Damasio and how he puts it. So here we go. In Chapter 1, we talked about emotion as one of the most important rules of thumb available to System 1 as it makes decisions. If a choice feels better to our System 1 minds, it is better. Emotional impressions remain in the brain as somatic markers, written on the flesh, as Antonio Damasio puts it, ready to be accessed when there's a relevant decision to be made. Emotion guides and simplifies decision-making, giving us an imperceptible nudge in one direction or the other, helping us to decide between options, including those that might, on the face of it, look equally good. But how do you come to feel good about a brand or product, especially if you've not experienced it? You may not have experienced that brand, but you've experienced something that created a positive impression, and that something is often advertising. Much as a stalagmite is formed by the constant dripping of mineral-rich water over many years, long-lasting emotional impressions are formed in us by advertising through repetition. They may take a little time to form, but these emotional associations imprinted in the flesh help us to make quick and easy decisions between the options in front of us when the moment comes.
Fantastic. But it's not just like actual science that helps us, kind of neuroscience that helps us understand the impact of emotion. There's marketing science has plenty of evidence as well to talk about it.
It does indeed. When you look at the most useful and perhaps the most, I think it's fair to say it is the most comprehensive effectiveness database in the world, which is owned by the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. Analysis that's been conducted by Les Binet and Peter Field on a number of occasions of this effectiveness database has revealed that campaigns that have emotion at their core are twice as likely to achieve profit gains as rational campaigns. And they're even more likely to create profit gains than advertising campaigns that have a kind of rational message that's sweetened with the kind of an emotional wrapper, a kind of velvet glove wrapped in the wrapping round the iron fist of the message. So emotions are really important. Emotional response is so important to advertising, and it's important when you conceive your campaigns to have an emotional outcome in mind.
And
so
that makes it...
I suppose that, well, I was just going to say, Tom, it kind of means that we have to have a way of measuring emotion, a systematic, a consistent and sensitive way of measuring emotional response to things, because I guess that can help us to predict the effect of advertising and help to develop it too.
Exactly. I mean, if you're putting emotion at the forefront, then you need to be able to test for it. And what we do at System1 Research is we use the system of emotions that kind of revealed by the work of Paul Ekman. Paul Ekman is the leading emotional psychologist, and for decades he has worked on demonstrating that there are a set of core emotions that are universal to human beings. They show up in the same way on the face in every culture. And he's kind of validated this worldwide. He's explored this in a series of books and papers, and it's been replicated a large number of times. So it's the perfect system, really, to build emotional testing on. His set of 7 core emotions are, you can see them and the facial expressions associated with them on your screens: contempt, disgust, anger, fear, sadness, happiness, and surprise. And then there's also an 8th emotion there between sadness and happiness, which is neutrality, that resting face that you can see. And in our testing, we ask that because, of course, it's entirely possible to feel nothing at all about an advert or any other piece of stimulus. And so what we do is we show people adverts and then we simply ask them, how did it make you feel? One simple but vital question. And once they've decided what emotion it is that they've made them feel, once they've kind of responded, we show them the faces to encourage very quick System 1 response. We ask them, how intensely did you feel it? And show them a few more faces that represent different degrees of intensity. So between these two questions, what did you feel and how strongly did you feel it, we can calculate the predictive emotion into action score, which has been validated in terms of predicting ad effectiveness. And then from the emotion into action score, we simplify that into a star rating. 1 star, which is a below average ad that is likely to require more than average investment to get any return from, and 5 star, which is an excellent ad that will reward investment and create more bang for your buck, if you like. So looking at these 7 emotions plus neutrality, what you'll probably notice is how many of them are negative. All the first 5 there on the screen are negative, and there's only one unequivocally positive emotion, happiness. There's also surprise, which is a fleeting emotion that actually will quickly resolve one way or another, generally into a positive or negative feeling. So we ask which. Now, there isn't time in this webinar to go into detail on the 5 negative emotions. There's plenty in the book about the separate effects that each of them might be associated with. But the one thing they all have in common is that if you're using them in advertising, and it can be very useful to, you need to resolve them. You can create a very powerful ad by using negative emotion and then resolving it into a positive feeling, positive happiness that will help you lay down that somatic marker. It's ultimately happiness, that positive emotion, that you need to be aiming for, whatever your market, whatever your sector. How you feel and making your customers feel good through your advertising is the primary goal of it, aiming for emotion. So, having established this, I think probably it'd be a good idea to look at a couple of these best of the best 5-star ads. And we've got a good case study here. Orlando, would you like to take us through?
Sure, of course.
Monte the Penguin.
And in fact, the ad that we're about to describe, which is for John Lewis, an upmarket retailer in the UK, demonstrates very nicely, actually, Tom, what you've just been saying about creating an emotional narrative where you set up quite a high level of sadness, which is then resolved beautifully, by the narrative and the happiness that builds as a result. But this ad, Monte, which is all about a boy at Christmas time and his pet penguin, is one of several spots created by Adam and Eve DDB and John Lewis. A Christmas spot which they've become very famous for over the years, with every new ad that they air. And perhaps for those of us who haven't seen the Monte ad, perhaps Tom, you could just read out a quick description from the book of what it's all about.
Certainly, yes. It tells the story of a boy and his pet penguin, Monte. We see several vignettes of the pair playing happily and affectionately together everywhere they go. But something's missing. Love is all around, and Monte becomes aware that he doesn't have a partner. The boy realizes this too, and on Christmas morning takes Monte downstairs to open a very special Christmas present. It's another penguin, a partner for Monte. We cut to the boy's mum, who sees the touching gift the boy has bought for his pal. And then we cut back to the boy, who's playing with what we now see is actually his stuffed toy penguin and new toy penguin companion.
So a very engaging and quite touching piece of advertising. And Monte the Penguin was extremely effective in the marketplace. It was one of 4 adverts that over the course of 4 years helped John Lewis to grow their market share from 22% to 29%. And we tested each of these ads with our emotional response measure, and looking at here the analysis of how the ads have done. So the top graph here shows the emotional response to each of those 4 spots. One of these is Monte the Penguin, and you can see the emotion into action score on the bottom axis there. And then we've just plotted the actual annual point share growth that was seen as a result of each of these spots. And you can see that there is, that our emotion into action model predicts that the higher the emotional response, the greater your share gain. Underneath that, we've got the actual share gain that was achieved by John Lewis in those years. And you can see that the actual share gain mirrors very neatly the modeled prediction that we gave above, at a very high level of correlation, 0.85. So this emotional model helps us to predict growth, but it also, because we know how ads perform and that there is this relationship between the two, it helps us to test for and help the development of emotional advertising that will create profitable growth.
And one of the important things about Monte is that it's a long-term campaign. It's part of a long-term campaign. But a question that we're very often asked in terms of advertising is, how do you get that kind of long-term effectiveness? And we've looked into this and we've got some interesting advice.
That's right. One of the things that we include in the book is a new idea based on the psychology of processing fluency. And processing fluency, as we've mentioned in earlier webinars, is our ability to process easily and quickly what we see, and to understand, very quickly what it is. The ads that we're showing you now on the screen are all actually by one creative director, John Webster, a brilliant creative who worked for BMP in the 1970s, 1980s. And he created a number of, he called them properties, brand properties. We call them Fluent Devices. So these are devices that that enable quick processing of the brand and refresh the neural networks associated with your brand. And what they do, these Fluent Devices, is they not only enable quick processing of your brand, but they also achieve very high levels of emotional response. So they are a way of creating both fluency and feeling all in one go. And the great thing about processing fluency, anything that enables and speeds up processing fluency, is that we like things that we can process quickly. We confer liking on them, and we tend to pay more for them. So they're literally creating value and reducing price sensitivity to the brand. So this is just one way to create long-lasting campaigns, by revisiting a device, a character over the years. There are other ways to do it too, perhaps with slogans. So there are all sorts of ways of doing that. And we touch upon some of these in the book. We don't have time to do it justice now, but there are just some ideas about creating longevity in your campaigns.
Now, because we were showcasing there the work of the amazing John Webster, all those campaigns date from a particular era, the 70s and 80s, and a particular country, the UK. So they have enormous resonance for those who were watching TV there and then. But the Fluent Device itself is cross-cultural because it works by processing fluency. It works by activating System1, which is universal. It is effective across all times and places. And we've actually seen in the fairly normally quite staid financial services sector, got a couple of examples here of Fluent Devices from the last 10 years or so. At the top there, for any British consumers, is a meerkat, and that would immediately bring to mind the Compare the Meerkat, aka comparethemarket.com campaign. A price comparison website, Compare the Market, which used a family of eccentric Russian meerkats to advertise its products over the years. And then below it you see from America a gecko, the Geico gecko, which helps sell insurance for Geico. So the Fluent Device, it may have fallen a little out of fashion, but it's still a very strong way of building that long-term brand positivity and positive emotional communications. And that leads us really to the final part of our presentation, which are the three strategic priorities for approaching your advertising, your creative and testing process. The first of which is to take a long-term approach, whether with Fluent Devices or something else. You need to be aiming for long-term profitable growth. One of the really important findings from Binet and Field's work is that emotional ads are more effective over the long term than the short term. They are still effective in the short term. A great emotional ad will boost sales, but they really pay off over the long term. The gap really widens between the effectiveness of emotional communication and the effectiveness of other kinds of communication, the velvet glove and iron fist, mixed rational emotion mode, and just rational. So take a long-term approach is the first priority, the first kind of bit of advice. The second is aim for a wide audience. Again, this is becoming slightly rarer in terms of advertising practice as demographic enclaves become more easy to target and fashionable to target. But what we know from marketing science over the years and what marketers continually rediscover is that profitable growth generally comes from selling people to people who don't know you yet, who don't buy you already. And one of the really great ways to do that, to grow fame for your brand, to aim for fame, is to aim for that wider audience, to go for reach. And an emotional ad is a particularly good way of doing that, because a great emotional ad tends not to be tied to particular demographics. It may seem like that emotional ads do particularly well among, there might be an ad aimed at teens or women or at particular kind of age groups and other demographic groups in society, but what you actually find is that generally something that hits big with one group will almost certainly hit big emotionally with others. So an emotional ad is a great way to aim for that wider audience. And the third piece of advice is to invest. If you've got good emotional creative, put money behind it. And what Binet and Field are finding in their current work, which is being published this year on marketing in the digital age, is that there's been a worrying trend towards it being an either-or situation. Either you have emotional creative work, in which case there's this fallacy that it pays for itself, that it will do well whatever, or you have kind of less emotional, more activation or message-led work, and then you put money behind it to seed it and get it out there. In fact, if you put emotional advertising is much more efficient. If you put money behind emotional advertising, you will get more bang for your buck. Your each point of excess share of voice will pay off more if you have a 5-star ad than if you have a 1-star ad. So the 3 bits of advice there, you can summarize them if you like as extend, take a long-term approach, befriend, aim for a wider audience, and spend. If you've got emotional creative, invest in it. And that brings us to the end of the webinar. If there's one sentence we'd like to leave you with, it's this: the more people feel, the more people buy. Emotion is the key. So we've now got time for a question or two, I think. Orlando, have any come through?
Yes, we have got one here, Tom. How can this thinking help in the development of creative work?
That is an excellent question. And actually, in the book, we have another case study, which was from an ad that Orlando was.
Yes, I was involved in a small way. So this ad, the other ad that we talk about in the book is the Guinness Made of More basketball ad, which won an effectiveness award for it's the growth that it achieved for Guinness in the UK and Ireland. It was actually developed by BBDO in New York. And we were asked to test a number of ads early on in the development process in animatic format. And we did test them, and it was basketball that achieved the highest score. But there were a number of things that we thought could be improved for the final execution. And one of these was the voiceover that basically lasted pretty much the length of the entire advert. And one of the things about voiceovers is that they're speaking to the viewer's system 2, and system 2 is engaged, and there's a high level of cognitive load as system 2 tries to understand what's going on, and this sort of impedes the emotional response. And often it's best to let the, especially if it's a particularly visual, storytelling type ad, it's best to let that storytelling have its effect, its emotional effect on the viewer. So we tested a version of the ad with no voiceover at all. We saw an improvement in emotional response, and this led to the advert that you're no doubt familiar with today, which has much reduced voiceover. So this is just an example of how emotional testing and iterative testing can help get from one place to the next and improve your effectiveness in the marketplace.
Absolutely, it can be those tiny executional details like music and voiceover that can really make the emotional difference. Well, that's all we have time for. If you do have any other questions or would like a copy of the webinar, I think you'll get sent a copy of the webinar anyway, but please do get in touch and we'll be very happy to answer them. The next webinar in a couple of weeks' time will be on Chapter 4, talking about brand building and fame, feeling and fluency, our paths to brand success. And all the chapters will soon be available. The Chapter 5 on shopper marketing will shortly be available to download. The other 4 are already available to download, and the print book will be out next month. So thank you very much for attending. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you, Orlando.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.